Renee, another episode. What are we talking about today?
Well, today we're going to be diving into evidence-based therapy practices and kind of do a little bit of a deep dive with family therapy, but talking about like what are some of the challenges for people that are really wanting to do good therapy practices versus evidence-based and all that good stuff. So I'm excited to hear this conversation. I think it's going to be really good for our listeners out there to understand what the differences of types of therapy are and plus like what the pluses and minuses are of evidence-based and all of that. But before we get into that, what is happening at the farm here at the end of January?
This is that time of year. It's just cold, cold, cold. So things are
Mm.
at just a grinding halt. It's a good time to listen to the webinars, think about spring. But, I'm just not motivated to do anything when it's so cold out.
Yeah, no, I can't imagine your barns and stuff are very warm, your out
Yeah,
houses and stuff this time of
and we
year. I
don't
bet you
have
they're
a
not.
fancy heated shop. So, we made a mistake
Yeah.
when we built it 10 years ago that we didn't heat the whole thing because we were saving money at the time. Wish we would have heated it, but it still would be cold out. So,
I think some of your equipment might just be mad that trying to even try to start this time of year. I
yeah,
think this be
it's
making some
true.
racket. Be like, I don't think so. You
True.
gotta wait till it warms up before you even try
So,
to start me. So
thinking about
yeah, that
spring.
makes sense. All right. So today we were talking about lots of therapies, and I think you wanted to kind of dive in on a lot of family, kind of coming from a children's perspective. So why don't you talk to me about the different types that are available, and let's dive into like the evidence based of this and see where we go.
Yeah, I think, the whole point of the conversation is there's so many great practices out there that have really great data that research shows that they're very effective. And so it's acronym soup, right? I could go through all the acronyms, but when we talk about this, we talk about parent-child interaction therapy. We talk about multidimensional family therapy. We talk about functional family therapy, brief strategic family therapy, structural family therapy. All of these therapies, of course, go by acronyms, multi-systemic therapy, right? MST. And so all of them have an acronym, which Renee loves it when we talk about acronyms. And all of them, and we'll have links to them so you can see them in the show notes. And all of them are going to have great data behind them
Hmm.
showing that they're very effective at what they do. But if that's the case, and if we know that any one of these practices are more effective, why aren't more folks doing them, Renee?
Oh, yeah. Well, I have a question. So, because I just don't know, because I was a therapist, but I didn't dive into all these specialties. But are these additional like certifications you have to add to your name with like additional credentials and after your initials,
Yeah,
it adds all the credentials?
good.
Well, that's the other challenge with, I have to see two sides of this. So we'll dive into your question in just a second about the evidence base. But from a provider's point of view, you have to invest time, energy, effort, money into keeping up all of these additional credentials. And we're going to get to the whole conversation here is to what end, right? And I'm telling you that I did not do that because I couldn't find the value for me in adding a bunch more extra initials after my name because you're just paying for those extra initials year after year to keep things up, or you're having to reinvest in additional training to keep your credentials. And so for me and what the practice I was personally doing, this isn't about anybody else, but I didn't have that kind of capacity workflow to justify or that specialty to justify me having additional credentials, which is also why I don't have a PhD. I did not, for the path I wanted to live, see the value add for the more paying for school for me personally. That is not about anybody else. Other people can see what they're exactly what they want to do with it, get that degree so they have a path of where they're going. But I didn't have that path, so I chose not to. So we're saying that these are all specialty credentialed services. And so as a family member, though, I could ask for these different types of services and they do different things for me, right? I'm guessing that how you work with me based on one of these is different. And so maybe it works best for certain clients than others. Is that the general
Yeah,
gist of what we're talking about here?
absolutely. All of the models take extra training, right? And so whether it's a
Yeah.
credential formally or not, it's extra training and it's really more intention around the approach that they take. And some of these approaches work much better with different types of populations, whether, it's more of a legal involvement with a legal
Mm,
system or whether it's more whatever the family issue may be. A lot of it has a component which includes parenting education and skills,
mhm,
right? Because
mhm,
when we think
mhm.
about family therapy, it looks at that whole family ecosystem. And I think that's part of what makes these so successful is when we think about the approach. and taking the time and the extra reviews, the extra supervision for the clinician in helping them to maximize what they can bring to the conversation. And, I'm a big advocate of these types of things, but at the end of the day, I think your concerns are very valid as to what is the incentive for us to deliver these high quality approaches, right? A lot of
Mm.
folks want to because it's better outcomes, right?
Mhm.
Overwhelmingly, I can send you to websites for all of the ones I listed, and we can see study after study that indicates, hey, this is actually better than just a standard therapy approach. Unfortunately, reimbursement is the same. So, what
Ah.
do you think is going to happen if we have the opportunity to deliver something that we know is going to be more effective? Maybe, most of the time, 40% more effective in outcomes data, but we get paid the same amount
Mm.
for doing the same thing. Which one ends up winning out, do you think, Renee?
My guess is just like my decision was not to continue the specialty path, because if you don't get reimbursed differently for going down that path, or get any kind of help for you to continue the training or to keep up the credential or whatever it is, depending upon what type. Yeah, I could really see that. Now, I could see if there's something about how you were trained as a clinician, and there were some of those things. Like I had to pick a particular theory that I wanted to work with to be trained as a clinician, and it was part of my original training, and that was sort of the bent, the mindset, the way I would work
Mhm.
and how I would work as a therapist. If that was some of these, I could see that, because it
Yeah.
just sort of frames how you do your job every day, and you would want to pick something evidence-based in that basic training.
Hmm.
But to justify ongoing trainings and ongoing certifications, especially if you have to keep them up year after year, you really do need to think about like what's that return on investment. And so, and for some, if you really specialize in one of these, I can imagine maybe you have a bigger booming practice, and maybe you can do some private pay clients that you can get paid better for. I mean, so there may be, but you have to think through, is that really how your practice is going to be? Because here's one of the bad things about being a clinician we don't ever talk about, but you don't get any business training. And everybody walks out the door and thinks they're going to own a private practice. People, that's a business. And if you don't know how to run a business, you're going to be in the hole quick. And it's not just a business, but you have to deal with insurance and deal with, getting on everybody's panel and knowing how to bill properly and having the wherewithal to be able to rebill when they turn you down and all this stuff. And so, unfortunately, in this space, not only is it about the therapy itself, it's about the practice. And people don't always have the supports that they need to know how to do it.
Well, and that's the same with nonprofit organizations.
Oh, yeah.
That we frequently consult with folks and sit down and do strategic planning with organizations. And, it's very common that it's happened twice in the last 2 weeks where we sat down with the organization. They said, hey, we want to be, and our strategy and our vision is to be the very best in providing children's services in our community. I go, that's great. That's a great goal. And then in the same breath, they say, but we have to be able to balance a budget. And
Yeah.
so I said, okay. And they go like, we've invested, X amount of dollars in these three staff to be able to deliver this service, but we're losing our shorts delivering that
Yeah.
service. And so what's my response when I hear that? Is like, I really wish you could do that service, but it's not viable. So you have
Right.
to stop doing that service. Unless you're going
Right.
to go find someone who's willing to pay you for it, it's not within your current funding. It's not within the bill codes you can currently bill any of your existing, you
Right.
know,
Well, I think
insurance
back
or
to, remember that conversation you had with the guy that had too many child psychologists in that
right,
particular office, and they
right.
weren't looking at how to use him with telehealth and other people's offices to
Hmm.
bill? What? And so again, that's a lack of a business knowledge and acumen. And so then you've got two psychologists with people would die for in the children's space. But if
Hmm.
you don't have a way to promote them, fill them up, use all their time and then some to pay for it, to your point, you can't keep them, because then you're gonna be underwater and you can't afford the people you've brought in. And so yeah, it's a big, big deal. So, as far as like as a therapist goes, I mean, this has kind of become a provider heavy conversation, but for a provider, you have to know why you're offering the type of service you're offering, and then
Right.
how are you going to get paid for it? And that's
And
some basic stuff.
it's basic sustainability planning. And guess how most of these things come to be? It's because there's always a grant to start something new. There's
Oh
always
yeah.
a grant to promote a best practice. There's always a grant that says, hey, we'll train you to do something. But there's never ongoing funding. So your first 3 years is great. You train up, you have some offset to be able to do these things. And then guess what? You're supposed to continue it, but there's no plan to continue it because it actually costs you twice as much to deliver the service and you have no way of recouping your cost. It's very frustrating for me. And this is, I get on a soapbox about this
Yeah.
because I wish we could continue the practices that we know have the basis that we know that work. But still, even though we're promised time and time again that we want to pay for results, we want to pay for outcomes, our system doesn't pay for it. And that's
Yeah.
not just that we've seen that in multiple states where there's these huge training grants that millions and millions of dollars flow in to train people, but then it dies once you
Yeah.
get to the end of that grant period.
It's always that piece that you and I talk about without the train the trainer piece for a person who's going to be there long term.
Right.
You leave that part out and it all crumbles. But from another perspective, I just wanted to share this is another interesting way that this has gone awry, trying to get to evidence based. But within corrections in our state and several other states, wanted to do, lots of substance use training and which is highly needed by incarcerated individuals. There's a lot of mental health and substance use that goes on that got them to where they are and the bad choices that they chose to make. And so, you have these programs that they could offer inside to work on whatever those issues are. Well, then the best practices and standards decided, well, they would have to keep therapy notes or they would have to do whatever there was requirements for to be able to call it whatever. And so then instead of diving in to continue the program because to keep the evidence based, they just decided, well, we can't do that anymore because we're not going to maintain the paperwork and stuff. So we're just going to stop those programs that were effective and evidence based.
Mm-hmm.
And my guess is they weren't paid to having do the notes and stuff, right? So to your point,
Right.
they're not paid to the level they needed to be paid or reimbursed or time wise or resources to be able to do all that extra requirement to make it evidence based. So they stopped. What happens then is the incarcerated individuals who really needed those services then have to kind of get them in other ways, but it's not by trained individuals. It's not by people who would be credentialed. And so is it really the same kind of treatment or training? It becomes a lot more heavily on like the AANA type community models of care, which work for some, but not for all. And so then you get really a lot lesser quality programs. So it's this balance, right? Of you're not reimbursed to do the good stuff. So what do you do? And then sometimes the whole program gets pulled because we're not reimbursed to do the good stuff. And
Right.
so
And
this,
would it be great to know how recidivism, how that impacted when they stopped delivering the training that they knew was more effective?
yeah,
But we don't look that far down the road, right? We don't look
no,
5 years back and say, oh, you know what? It was when we stopped doing that, that 2 years later we saw increased recidivism. We don't take a long look at these things. We look at the short-term cost and make knee-jerk reaction decisions and then don't go back and measure the impact of our decisions. And I think that's the frustration, right? And so when we think about evidence-based practice and we think about how do we implement it, how do we fund it, and how do we support it, it's really about why aren't we using data in our healthcare system,
yeah,
especially in our behavioral healthcare system, because that at the end of the day is what the issue is.
right. And so we all talk about evidence based on the front end to start the service. That's the common conversation. The grants, the startup, whatever is there.
Right.
But then you don't hear that the whole concept of how it was evidence-based to begin with was after that, to your point,
Right.
after that. And so, we're going to talk here now about this. We talked about this at our podcast last week that we're going to tie to now is that the biggest gap in evidence-based is the evidence after you're providing the service. I have a particular assessment that right now we are using and dislike it a lot because it is the least evidence-based I've ever seen in my whole life because it's so subjective. And there's no
Mhm.
way, whatever the original model would be, I don't even have to know what the original model would be to know that there's no way that it's evidence-based or that it's up to fidelity because what the product is now without a blind eye, never seeing the original, you can tell that ain't it because it's so all over the place based on personalities and people and locations and stuff. And they're trying to tell me because we've sunk so many years into this, it's the it's that lost, is it sunk cost fallacy, they call it. But they've sunk in so much money into it to this point for so many years that we have to keep it. Wow, bad. And so there's no good outcomes coming from this. There can't be because it's just how it's done isn't correct. And so Can't be. And I know enough about what we're talking about here to eyeball it and go, wow, that's not right. And so how do you go about that? Do you go back to shore up what we've had because we're going to use it regardless? Now we have to fix it. Or are we like, wow, it's so far gone, you can't keep it? And I don't know. But you don't have those conversations because nobody looks at the data. So then it feels like it's just a subjective person's opinion that it's bad. And I'm like, no, if you pulled some data, I bet you could prove it's not good because to your point, the data would back it up because whenever it went off the rails, however many years ago that was,
Mhm.
you should be able to see a shift in the data.
Mhm.
And so the missing mark of evidence-based conversations is exactly that, because you can't prove the evidence one way or the other. And that was the whole reason you started the conversation about evidence-based, was that you had the evidence to show this is better, this is not. So what do you think the hangup is, Jason? Why don't we measure? I mean, is it because we're moving so fast, new thing to new thing to new thing to new thing? Or what keeps us from actually looking at, does this work?
Well, part of it is that sometimes we overanalyze things, and sometimes we just need to step back and go, "What are we doing?" Right? This is why I really like the social drivers of health framework. Right? I really think it's very simple. We can measure: is someone housed? Is someone safe in their community? Is someone able? To get food, take care of themselves, meet their basic needs, right? And so
Right.
there's something to looking at health across the board as to how are we moving forward. And so I think as we were able to kind of roll back and think about these things differently in context of, is someone reaching their full potential, that might help us, because otherwise we analyze stuff to death.
Yeah.
This is where sometimes I get frustrated with higher ed that will send something to a university and say, hey, can you research this? And then 2.5 years later, we get back a report that says we need further research. And so it's like, I get it, like we need to take a measured approach sometimes. However, it doesn't mean we should just be in paralysis, right? If we can look at something and we can see that the relevance isn't there, we know that there's no data, we got to find some measures that start to measure it. And they may not be perfect from the start, right? We talk about this: start somewhere. It may be the wrong thing you start with, and then you pivot and you go to something, but you're at least making decisions based upon a standard that you believe is measuring what you think it is.
Right. And in our world, in corrections where I am currently, they record all kinds of data. So sometimes it's just asking the right question, because if you know the date at which something shifted, you might be able to actually go look at the trend data and say, did it change from this date forward? But you have to know that that's a question you're asking and know when the shift occurred. And so we are working in corrections with a couple of really great organizations who can do that for you, that can look at the historical data. And our corrections department does a great job of collecting lots and lots of data. Where it is just the analytic piece of that, like actually
Right.
looking at it to answer the questions you have. It's not, in our case, it's not a lack of data. Some places they don't even collect it correctly, so you don't even have data to
Right.
look at. And we've been there. Like I remember you and I talking in the state of North Dakota, and I wanted to know the budget for the state hospital, and I wanted to know how much it was, but I also want to know where the money went, and they didn't know. Well, that's
Right.
different because it didn't matter how many questions I asked, they didn't even track it to know it, because I think they just didn't want
Right.
to know, which is their purview. I wouldn't recommend it, but that was their plan. And so then when you go to ask for that, it just doesn't exist. That's different. But sometimes you collect it, but you are just so busy collecting that you don't use it. And you need another party to look at it and go, hey, you could look at trends from 2015 forward, and this is when this happened and shifted, so you could see if it changed. And so we're doing some of that work now, and I'm really hoping to kind of get it, because you feel like you're flying by the seat of your pants when you don't. So back to these provider conversations, right? If you're using your whatever it is that you've chosen, your baby of the way you do business, and you can't actually show that it's actually making a difference, you need to reevaluate that and
Right.
decide, if you have a clinic of 6 different clinicians and 3 use this type, 3 use this type, you can start to look at, is it, are they getting discharged sooner using one version or the other? Are they more successful? Are they returning back to the office? There's ways to break that down to make some sense. And so, you've got to think through, like, is it is it worth it? Is it the juice worth the squeeze, right? Is it
Right.
there to continue that work, or is it not? And then if it's not, then don't collect the data. I mean, don't continue to collect a bunch of stuff that's not
or
useful.
or don't continue to do that service, right? It's all about return on investment. And so we need to make more decisions based upon are we getting the ROI of our investment
That's right.
on this particular practice, or are we doing this because it feels good for us? And we
Right.
need to make less decisions in the nonprofit world, especially that shouldn't do things because it feels good or it feels like we should. We should do
Mhm.
things because A, it's paying the bills and we're making a difference and making impact. And so, I
Yeah.
think that's what we need to be focused on. And so oftentimes when I go into places, they're telling me we want to do this because it feels good. And I'm like, well, that's great. I'm glad you feel warm and fuzzy about it, but let's talk about the deficit because that's what we're here for, right?
Warm and fuzzy. That's what we're doing. So, in the recovering politician self-care policy of the week, we talked about it at the start of the show. It's freaking cold outside and it's dark and it's dreary. This time of year is hard for me. Sometimes there's fresh snow, so that brightens me up for a minute, but then it's that dark, nasty snow that you're like, could it just melt so we could get on to spring? And spring's a couple months away. So, think about what you could do to schedule yourself something fun, whether it's currently some of us like held over maybe some holiday stuff we talked about and have some holidays that you're going to party. I have a friend that's going to the Great Wolf Lodge with their kids. They do it all the time in a particular week in January. So it's a holiday gift, but out so they have something to look forward to. Think about what you could do because otherwise it's just depressing this time of year. And lots of folks with seasonal affective disorder or SADS know that it's just rough this time of year because you can't really get out. You're more isolated than you could. So think about what you can schedule. And I know Jason's already looking ahead. Jason, do you have something scheduled to look forward to?
Spring break. I can't wait. So every
I know you
year,
always book that in advance, and that's so cool because you have something to look forward to
right?
every year, and you're still doing your whole family thing, right? The whole fam gets to go.
Whole family. So I'm just focused on been watching some spearfishing videos. So I'm, got to
Oh,
get back into
good.
it's hard to train. It's hard to train for spearfishing in the middle of winter. You can't really, it's hard to hold your breath underwater for 60 seconds and train. So like sometimes in the bathtub or something, but it just doesn't work out that well. So I need some pool time or something.
Spear fishing. Yeah, that's a tough one in Iowa to train for, I would guess. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
hear it.
yeah.
Well, today we talked a lot about types of evidence-based therapy practices and whether there's barriers to that or worth the effort to do it, right? And a lot of times we're just not trained as clinicians or as nonprofit leaders to look at is it worth it? And they'll sell you this great shiny object that's evidence-based and you should do it and there's better outcomes. But then do you have the data collection in place to actually assure one, it's done correctly, two, fiduciary, and does it two, is it actually making you money to keep you in business? And so hopefully this was helpful to you. We'll see you next time. Have a great week.